your exhibition at the Bolinas Museum is so beautiful. Your aesthetic is outstanding, and the purpose and the meaning of your work in photography and glass to bring light to what's happening in the Arctic and the Antarctic is very powerful. It's one of the environmental questions of our time. So before we talk about your art, I'd like to go back just a little bit about your academic history. As a professor, you spoke of teaching students who would have careers managing valuable and vulnerable natural resources, and they would need to handle challenges that you couldn't even imagine at the time. How do you prepare people to look into that future and be adaptable?
Well, I think that there are a lot of tools that are available for thinking about the environment and the interaction of different parts of the environment. Um, I don't know that you're old enough to remember, but when I was in college, there was a bumper sticker, and people used to have on a bumper sticker, "Ecology Now." And that was a big environmental protest, and people were just figuring out how things were related, and how to manage the interrelationships. And so at the time, another key term was interdisciplinarity. And students had to be trained in data law and policy and in basic sciences, and then the specific sciences in the area that they were interested. And we didn't know how that was going to go together. Designing a curriculum was a bit of a food fight. And it was just fascinating to know that they were going to do things that we never heard of. One of them, for example, when I started teaching, nobody had ever heard of global climate change. It just wasn't on the issue radar for another, half a decade, maybe a decade. And then it didn't become popularly discussed for very long after that. Restoration. We'd have to ask Marianne, but restoration ecology, I think, evolved in the 80s and early 90s. And so all these things that our students were doing, each one of us had a piece, and they had to put it together in their own way to make the science work, and to make the work, and to make their lives work. So it's been a very interesting period.
And your teaching style was very collaborative, which was somewhat unusual in the hierarchical status of a university. How did you come to that collaboration?
Well, I think that one of the problems that we had, knowing that we didn't know what we were training them to do, was that we had to figure out, well, you always have to know who you're training, but encouraging people to have their own ideas is essential if they're going to get out and do something on the ground that's beneficial. I have a friend that teaches Chaucer, and I guess it's all gets reinterpreted every 20 or 30 years, but this is just starting from scratch every 20 or 30 years. So you better be able to collaborate with everybody, and you better be able to collaborate with the people you're working with when you're on the ground, and you better start that in school and have that be one of the values that you learn to prioritize. So much of school is competitive, and grading on a curve, I think, is a fundamental sin, because if somebody does better, somebody else does worse. It seems to me that you have to learn that everybody does better when everybody does better. So, sort of my thoughts. But Marianne suffered through years of it. She might have a better idea.
How many years, Marianne?
Oh, God. Sophomore, junior, senior.
Yeah, three in undergrad and then 2 in grad school.
5. You got more than the usual dose.
And you've been collaborating ever since. Well, Sally, you told me that it was one of your students that brought climate change to your attention. And
well, I knew that. Well, it was at my attention, but I didn't know very much about it then. And I have to tell you, if I wanted to know something about climate change now, I would call Inez Fung or Barbara Allen Diaz or somebody. I wouldn't ask me. But I knew that I had to address it in the class, which was sort of a survey of environmental issues in the late maybe it was the early 21st century, I can't remember. But so I asked one of my students, and he came in and gave a lecture in my class. And it was an hour and 15-minute class. And I think he spent the first 20 minutes of class time setting up ice cubes that were supposed to be melting. And he had fans and he had heaters and he had candles and he had ice chips and icebergs. And he set them all up on the podium in the front of the room, which is a physics lab. And we're sort of unwelcome in the physics lab anyway. But so as he got through setting up, the class was a third over and there were puddles everywhere. And I was about to have a serious fit for him wasting all, my class's time. There's 600 kids sitting there. And if they waste 20 minutes, that's a lot of hours to waste. So then he walks to the podium and he said, I guess you're wondering why I took all this class time to set up all this ice melting and all these puddles. And, I was homicidal. So I said yes, along with everybody else. And he said, well, if you're not thinking about melting ice every minute of the day, you're missing the most important issue of your time and the one that's going to kill your grandchildren.
Wow.
So he put a lot of data on the board afterwards, and he had a lot of things to say about charts and ice cores and all this stuff. And I remember none of it. I remember that time. So it was an interesting teaching lesson as well. And he sure got my attention. So now one of my major goals is to make, I got in trouble with the physics department, I have to tell you, but my goal when I started to make ice and when I started to work with Gina, I wanted to have vulnerable ice on view in everybody's home. This was sort of my mantra, without wrecking the carpet or the furniture. And I went down a lot of rabbit holes, but that was the goal then. And well, once you've been working with Gina, you know a lot more than you used to. We started, Gina made me remember this. It's a wonder I do. We started making glass spoons because I had been making glass bowls and nobody notices a glass bowl. Mini bowls are glass. So I thought, well, if it's a glass spoon, everybody will notice. And
Because
anyway,
it's fragile.
Yeah, it's fragile. And, then you'll sort of take better care of it, and you'll be a little bit more cautious with it. And didn't work because nobody wanted a fragile spoon that they had to be cautious with. So I had a lot to learn from Gina.
Well, over time, you've developed almost a vocabulary in your glass that shows us the Arctic. You have many polar bears, you have ice. And how does ice and glass relate?
Oof. Well, that can be an intensely technical question because they're very, very similar in many ways. And they're, at the crystal and molecular level, they're very similar in some ways and very not similar in others. And maybe Gina will back me up on this or give me some backstopping. But basically, they both melt, they both flow, they both respond extremely to heat. And I think the thing that's most mesmerizing about the ice is the way the color flows together as the ice a lot of ice, ice flows, Fritjof Nansen proved that. And so the ice flows together in a way that strikes me visually as very similar to glass flowing. And getting that to look right, I haven't got it yet, but it's something that I work on constantly. And it's almost impossible, I think, but it gets close.
You also convey the power of your message of asking people to pay attention to the melting ice on the polar ice caps through your photography. And you started doing photography quite young. How did that come to be?
Yeah, these beautiful young women don't know this, but photography for me started with it. Do any of you guys know what a baby brownie is?
Yes.
They're these teeny little cameras. You can see them in museums now. It's very annoying. You can also see the toasters that we had when I was a little girl. But when I was 4, my dad gave me a baby brownie, and I knew exactly what I wanted to photograph. We went down to this little pond and I took pictures of swans, and they were little white spots just out in the middle of my photograph. And many of my polar bears in my photographs look exactly the same. But I have been, I thought I was a serious photographer then. I've always taken classes in photography. Became a scuba diver, and I took lots and lots of classes in underwater photography. And I guess I have to say I got pretty good at that. It's not shooting fish in a barrel, but it's a lot easier than glass. And I have taken a lot of, I mean, I used to travel with 3 large not cartons, what do you call those things? Pelican suitcases, the plastic water sealed ones, with all my camera equipment and tripods and lights and all this crap. I mean, swimming with a camera underwater is sort of like swimming with a garden chaise lounge. I mean, it's just very challenging. So I decided when my back went bad, that I would simplify. And now I have a rule, which I have not broken, which I think is really helpful to me, is I only take pictures with my iPhone. And I have a friend who's really iPhone savvy. And whenever the iPhone gets better than the one I have in a way that I'll notice it, she says, now buy another one. And so I do. So I love that. So I've
Your
simplified.
pictures of the animals, but also the ice. Your photographs of the ice in our exhibition here at the Bolinas Museum are very powerful, and they play off the glass itself. But you had a wonderful description to me about how you began, after visiting many times to the Arctic and Antarctic, how you began to read the layers of ice. And you used an example of the Nicasio Reservoir here in Marin County,
Yeah.
where drought has really emptied the water out, and you can see the layers. And that was fascinating. Will you talk about seeing that in the ice?
Well, the problem with photographs of the ice, I mean, you really, you have to put your finger in front of the lens to take a bad picture of ice. It's gorgeous. But one of the problems with that is it looks healthy. And it's so powerful, you can't imagine that there's anything wrong with it. So if you go down on one of those strips and you look at the ice, you think, oh my God, this is just, all you can see is the beauty and the power and the wildness. But I've been back several times, and so I've sort of gotten used to the fact that, first of all, there's more than ice. There's islands, that have big beaches and stuff that emerge in the summer. And of course, we go in their summer. I've only once been anywhere near going to the Antarctic in winter, and that's an experience you should miss. But in the Nicasio Reservoir, if you look at it, you can see the band that just got exposed because the water's drawing down. And then there are bands that go all the way up to the beyond the beach to where there are trees that are permanent. And if you've got that in mind, and then you look at island shores in the Arctic or the Antarctic, there'll be a place where the ice has always been until the last 3 years. And then there'll be places where the ice has always been for the last 5 years, and on and on and on, to places where there's still ice. And so you can see this layering in the plants, and also in the smoothness of the shore, or the shore. And so it's very similar, and it gives you an easy way, absent time-lapse photographs. I mean, a great way to see it is to see glaciers, like in Glacier National Park or in Alaska, where the glacier used to be here, and now it's, 3 townships over. But the Nicasio Reservoir is a really good analogy for looking at the receding ice as we look at the receding water. It's going the other way, but you take my point.
And as the ice recedes, why is that one of the most important issues of our time on our planet?
The first thing is something I think we're all familiar with, which is global climate change. I mean, global sea rise. And when most of an iceberg is underwater. If you're looking at ice on the surface, you're looking at 10% of whatever is there. One of the things that's important about both Greenland, which is amazing, and the Antarctica, which is a continent, is that a lot of that ice is up on land. So if you know, my ice cube in my drink melts, you know, the whole thing is diluting my drink. Similarly, if the ice on Greenland, which is above the water, it's not just 10% that's going to get added to the water, it's the whole cube. Did I say that well? I mean, did that make sense? So you're getting a lot more water in the oceans than has ever been there in the history of the planet. Well, I don't know that. Let me back off that. But you're getting a lot more water. Some islands have just completely disappeared in the West Pacific. So the water rises and the shore goes underwater. So that's one thing. It's just the changing water levels. Another one is the flow of the water throughout the planet, the Humboldt Current and other major flows of cold water from the Arctic, the Antarctic, it's a gyre or something like that. You know, the water shoots right up from the Antarctic. It shoots right up, and you know the joke is that Greenland is not green and Iceland is not particularly icy, and that's because of the Humboldt Current brings water that's warm here and blah, blah, blah. But all those circulatory patterns are going to change when the ice changes. And thirdly, there's an awful lot of people out there that are dependent on the island being there. And when their house goes underwater, they're going to be out of luck. So
well,
those are
also with the gyres that you were describing, that's changing our weather patterns all over the world.
Yeah, it's interesting. We didn't even know until the late 1800s, I believe, that Antarctica tripled in size in the winter and then went back to its normal size in the summer, and that ice was melting and freezing and melting and freezing and melting and freezing. And that's energy. I mean, you know, that's a lot of energy that's getting circulated. And what's going to happen to the climate when that doesn't occur is it's increasingly clear that it's not going to be good news.
Gina, you and Sally created a remarkable piece that is in the exhibition, the Tanker Bear. And it seems to be a solid bear, but you're going to tell us that it's not, within a glass like an oil tanker. And it's mysterious and catches people's attention. And the two of you, as I understand it, worked a long time to think through how to convey and achieve that idea. Gina, do you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, so Sally and I had been working together for a few years and working through some ideas, and she came to me with an idea that matched really well with my body of work. And so we spent a lot of time talking about how to use glass in a way to tell a story that a viewer could understand, but also it was aesthetically pleasing, because we were really interested in having objects that people wanted to spend time with and wanted to learn about. So we talked a lot about what the imagery would be and how best to describe that imagery. And so we landed on an oil tanker and a polar bear. And then we spent a while trying to figure out the technicalities of how to combine those things. So the bear itself is actually in the final piece, it's a negative image, and it was created through a molding process. And so it was a plaster silica mold that we created, and then had a hollow cavity of the tank. We filled that with glass, and then when we pulled away that mold, the bear became hollow and the tank became the solid object.
But Sally, you told me that taking out the mold and leaving the empty image was not easy.
No, well, I should say that's the part that I did. So that's the one I whinge about. Gina did the cold working, and she, you know, I'd like to hear her whinge about the cold working. But the hole in the glass that is the polar bear is in the molding process is plaster where you want the polar bear to be. And thing one, Gina can do this and I can't really, which is to figure out how you put the mold together so that there's a mold around a hole, and then there's a barrier around the mold so that you get a tanker and not just a big block. I mean, it's really, I mean, maybe it's the 70 years, 60, 50 years between us, but I can't do that. I can't keep that in my head long enough to get the bear right up. And I mean, it's hard. But the getting the plaster out of the mold, out of the tanker was my job. And I tried dental picks, and I tried pipe cleaners, and I tried
go up into it and remove
yeah,
the plaster.
yeah. Well, because and you can't, you just sort of, I mean, if you look at the piece, you have to go up a leg and then turn left to get it out of his nose and ear. And that took about 3 months. Then Gina took the thing and cleaned it, because glass that's been next to plaster, for reasons we'll have to ask Gina, is got a murky sort of matte finish. And if you want it to shine, you have to polish it. But we were sort of, I don't know if this is intellectual or aesthetically, but we didn't want it to look great, because you don't want the tanker to look terrific and say, boy, this carbon economy is just peaches and cream. So we had to leave dents and nicks and bashes in the tanker. And then I felt self-conscious about it, because I'm a lousy cold worker, and because I sort of thought it looked like we didn't know how to cold work, but that's part of it, and we had to leave it. And that was one of Gina's insights, that we couldn't clean it up too perfectly, or it would misrepresent the carbon economy.
Well, Gina, I want to come back to talking about your art in a little bit. I want to bring Marianne into this conversation. And I just learned from Sally, Marianne, that besides being a scientist and an environmentalist and an artist, you are you teach and coach kayaking, and you've competed on World Kayak Polo, correct me if I'm wrong, representing the United States, and you kayak out under the Golden Gate and kayak surf out in the ocean. Oh my God, girl.
Yeah, it's a blast. Yeah, I did play kayak polo. I have a good assortment of random things that I've done in my life.
Well, so you were a student of Sally's, and then you've gone on to do really amazing, interesting work on, particularly on water issues in California, which we are really very aware of water right now, with the droughts happening and what's happening to salmon. And what led that direction in your life, that was the way you went with your skills?
So I'm probably one of those rare people that goes to school and then ends up, there was not a direct path between school and what I'm doing now, but the master's thesis that I did when I was with Sally as an undergrad was about water trusts. And particularly, we were asking questions about how the land trust movement and the work that sort of Sally had studied for a really long time, how land trusts had that model that land trusts had for being adapted to water, to putting water back in creeks and streams, and how that changed when those tools and approaches were used for sort of an entirely different resource. And the answers were pretty interesting. So as part of that process, I got to go interview and talk to a lot of folks that now are my colleagues, which is quite a treat. And I got to know a lot of folks within the environmental community that were working on those issues at the time. So I took a little hiatus and did some art and some big brush painting and did some other things in between, and then ended up returning to the nonprofit world. So I work for a conservation nonprofit. We do fisheries conservation work focused on rivers and streams. And the meat of my work is essentially thinking about how to get water back in streams and how to collaborate with people in doing so. So it's really interesting, and it covers a lot of, my job has a lot of different components. And a lot of what Sally was talking about in terms of collaboration, things that she really fostered when I was a grad student working with other grad students in her lab. That's at the heart of what I do. I can think of no project that I work on in which I'm not partnering with other people of entirely different disciplines, learning a ton from the way that they see the world. And it's fascinating, right, to work with people who have just incredibly different lenses on what you're viewing. And do think about things like changing baselines in restoration and how, you know, what I see looks, you know, like a normal, beautiful creek to me, right? But from a geomorphic perspective, if you turn back the clock, it would have looked a lot different if you're thinking about how things have changed over time and what humans have done. So I think a lot of those sort of collaborative efforts that we had as a lab that Sally really cultivated and really fostered are things that are ever present in the work that I do now. And it's, you know, it's not like ego and relationship, you know, in the relationships, the professional relationships that I have, you know, either as an individual with other individuals or as organizations with other organizations. None of that goes away, but I think there's a lot of environmental problem solving and resource management comes down to the social pieces, right? It's not like the engineering solutions are easy, but oftentimes it's the social solutions and that problem solving that really is kind of the crux of being able to do anything. So, so back to the original conversation with Sally about how do you create and foster a group of folks who can solve environmental problems? I think a lot of it comes down to figuring out how you collaborate.
I love your description of working with people with entirely different visions and knowledge and having that come together. And the two of you have done quite a few books together, I think.
We've written quite a few articles, and I think we have one book, Sally. It's about the history.
Didn't you work on the land trust book?
Yes, the land conservation book with a whole bunch of co-authors.
You didn't do the food book.
No, I was going to write the lettuce chapter, but
yeah,
other things.
Well, in the middle of all that description, you talked about how you took time to paint and draw. And so, and that's part of the collaboration that we see in the Bolinas Museum right now. We have two of your plates. One is your drawings of California wildflowers, and one is your drawings of creatures from Duxbury Reef, which is here in Bolinas, that Sally, you made into decals and turned them into plates. You must have been surprised when you saw that finished work, Marianne, because they're beautiful.
They are beautiful. It was a really fun process. So I got really interested in botanical illustration a few years ago. And it's like a fascinating way to, again, like see the world, right? It provides an entirely different lens on, you go for a hike and you can think about things in terms of like terminology and botany specifically, right? Or you can just sit and look and in some ways like extract the same information, but kind of through a different route in your brain. And so Sally and I got talking about my interest and her, all her work with glass and sort of, you know, asking questions of each other. And so we started on this project that we've been calling Flora Invernessica, which was really a way to take, I think, the two things that we both really love and combine the two. And again, right, going back to collaboration, like it's just as fun to have, there's usually like the harebrained scheme. That's like the first step is the harebrained scheme, right? What's interesting to us and what questions do we want to explore and kind of what's fascinating here. And usually there's food involved in the harebrained scheming and good company. And sort of embarking on the project. And then one of the fun things is we picked the flowers and we picked all the little creatures that go in the squares together. And then I had kind of free reign to go out and draw them kind of in my own way. And then I sort of handed it over to Sally, and it was so much fun to sort of see what came back, right? Because I wasn't there for all of the glass making and that part of the process. And so like Sally's creativity sort of took off where mine, I don't know if ended is the right word, but we kind of each had our own pieces and then we're able to link the two. And I got them back and Sally had done a whole different range of plates and different sizes and different colors. And it was just really fun to see kind of the experimentation that went into it and absolutely gorgeous. So it's Sally has a phrase, it's like two brains are better than one.
Oh, I thought that was your phrase.
But that's true, you know, if you're writing a paper, you're writing a book, or you're whatever you're doing. But I think in this case, it was especially true, right? What you see is the product of the two brains. And anyway, so I think that that's at the root of the
And
collaborative
also,
effort.
Sally, in your work, but in those plates, the kind of the understatement of those plates, I see your time that you spend time in Japan. I see a lot of that sort of understated aesthetic that is more powerful because it is understated. They're really wonderful plates.
Well, they're fun. But you know, it's interesting. The collaboration with Gina is much more physical. I mean, when you're trying to build one of these molds, it's sort of like wrestling, you know, to get holding everything together while somebody else pours the plastic. I mean, it's just a really I'm just really interested in how very different working with Marianne and Gina is, because Gina and I just get, I mean, you just have to hold this stuff together while you're pouring and holding, and, you know, and then the goddamn thing is upside down and you have to start over. So it's much more physical.
Well, Marianne, with all your science work, where did art come into your life? Because they're beautiful drawings. How did you start doing art? Were you very young?
Yeah, I've been drawing my whole life. I think we got a drawing of a really meticulous ketchup bottle when I was about 4. And I've always been really, I think, meticulous. You know, like pen and ink and colored pencil and sort of these media that I can control really well. How I always gravitated toward those. And it's interesting because Sally, in some ways, even like from an academic perspective, I think I'd approach things from build it up in teeny tiny increments. And Sally's like, what's the big picture? Nothing, nothing's new, right? You can always look back and sort of get a bigger perspective on it. And I think Sally really pushes me as an artist because she's like, well, get out your big brushes, and try something a little bit different. So in some ways I think we're good collaborators. But so I've been drawing my whole life, and I had a period where I just sort of stopped, and then I needed it again, and I ended up taking a lot of botanical illustration courses through Merritt College in Oakland. The community college is an amazing program. It's offered on the horticulture campus, and that was kind of a way to bridge the scientific worlds that I dwell in with, which are really a lot more analytical with the art. And so I was taking a botanical terminology course at the same time I was doing botanical illustration. It was just fascinating to watch my brain flip, and go from being able to describe things in words to being able to describe things in images. And I really enjoy that. And I feel like they complement each other really, really well. And so I'll often take my sketchbook out. Sally and I will go on these, sketch and eats, right? And just go on a hike and, sit there for half an hour and draw a flower and how a leaf connects. And it's a fun way, a different way to allow yourself to see the world, often in very, very tiny, with a tiny little pen.
Sally, you told me that you really learned about art with Marianne, and she took you into museums or encouraged the way that you looked at art. What was that?
Oh, well, this is one of the great lessons of my life. There's so many things you can just, if somebody will just throw the switch, things flow from it. But I can't remember what we were looking at, but Marianne said, I just stomp through a museum and look at stuff. I don't know what I'm doing. And Marianne said, if something catches your eye and you stop to look at it, don't move on till you figure out what you stopped to look at, what caught your eye. And I have found that was years ago. That was when they were cleaning the D'Orsay and they kept sending all that stuff over here. Do you remember that? It was 10 years ago? And so we would always tromp in and see what we could, what I could see, which is not always very much. But now when I don't make myself read all those little cards. I know you work very hard on them, but I pay attention to what stops me. And then I'll read that card. and then I can't move on and go away until I figure out what stopped me. And frequently it's not what you think. I mean, you think you stop because the fruit is interesting, and it's not. It's because if you sort of close your eyes, you can see it's just the way the colors lie. So it's a very interesting way to go to a museum. If you don't know how else to do it, that's a good place to start.
Well, Gina, so you got this professor to be your student. I mean, she came to you and came with all this experience and all this thoughtfulness. That must have been so interesting. And then you've been working together since on different projects, but you two seem to really have a feeling that you share.
Sally took one of my classes. It was the first intensive workshop that I had taught right out of graduate school, and I had been teaching a lot of freshmen in college previous to that. And so I had a group of, professional and non-traditional students for the first time in a while. I knew it was going to be a great time. And then a few weeks after the class, she called me up, and I often have students call me up after classes and want to have a few lessons. And usually, it's like a couple lessons here or there. And Sally just seemed so excited and intense, and she just kept showing up at my studio for about a year, and then it turned into 2 years, and now it's been about a little over 5 years, I think. And she had such an interesting way of looking at the world, and it came from her academic background, but it also just came from her energy and her ability to bring collaborations just like this together. She won't let you just rest on your laurels. If she sees a connection, she makes the connection. We all joke that her birthday parties are the best event of the year because you get to meet everyone, and you make friends that you didn't know that you had, that you've heard about for years, or that you've heard a strange story that really resonates with you. And that's the environment that Sally creates. So it's really exciting to be a part of.
Well, and you heard the praise that she gave you as one of the best teachers she has ever had. So your art, looking at your work on your website, your art is really surprising and original. It's very, it's sculptural, mostly sculptural, and your techniques and what you choose to explore are so unique. So I want to know how you started in glass, but I also want to know what motivates these visions that you have, these creations. There's a theme to many of them.
Yeah. So I started, I've always been an artist my whole life, but I started working in glass when I was about 13. My great uncle was a stained glass artist, and so he taught me a little bit of the skill. And I don't know when I really got it in my head, but probably around 16 or 17, I was just like, I'm going to be a glass artist someday. Had no idea what that meant, had no idea how to do it. Was lucky to find a college that was close enough that my parents were happy with the location, and also had a glass program, which happened to be at Alfred University. And so did glass and neon, glass blowing, glass sculpture, and casting while I was there. And just really fell in love with the media first, although as an artist, I like to use the medium that's right to express my ideas. And that's something that Sally and I have worked a lot on, that glass is, it's a difficult medium to work with. It has a long period of learning, a much longer period than most materials. You really have to become a materials expert in order to use it. And it also has an environmental impact in its production that you have to be really aware of. And so for me, it was acknowledging that glass had a heavy impact on the world. And so the message that I was going to say with it needed to also have a heavy impact. I couldn't just make pretty objects with the material. And then from a personal standpoint, I grew up in northwestern Pennsylvania in a small oil town, and saw the impacts of environment and industry from a very, very early age. And it really followed me to every location that I've lived since. Just that kind of idea of the human impact that we have with our short-term choices and how it changes us as a species and it changes our relationship with the world. And so that's really what a lot of my work has been about.
It's powerful. So glass has a very ancient lineage, but you told me something I didn't know about. It's studio glass.
Mhm.
And would you tell other people what that is and why it's different from other glass making?
Yeah, so glass, is thousands of years old. It's been done all over the world. There's no singular country or region that can really call it its own. It was done in ancient Syria and Egypt and Afghanistan and Europe. But as a practice, it had a functionality for most of its history. And so, you had craftsmen in factories up until the 20th century. Really, it was a designer who would come in to design the object, and then it would be craftspeople who would make it. This was all over the world. Really, Murano, Italy was the only place that kind of escaped that, but they still had a functionality at their core, even in their creative pieces. So the studio glass movement is about 60 years old at this point, and it started in academia, really, with two artists, Dominic Labino, who came out of the factory world, and Harvey Littleton, who came out of a ceramic and artistic practice. And they started dabbling in it in Ohio for summer workshops. And they really taught the studio glass movement to the rest of what became the modern world. Again, there were craftsmen all over the world that were doing it, but they really brought it into an artistic practice and into an educational setting in a different way that had been done before. They had some contemporaries. Erwin Eisch in Germany brought it really to mainland Europe and spread it across Germany. And so glass became something less connected to the factory and more connected to educational settings and to creative craft.
I love that in this conversation with the three of you, you bring such a richness of diverse knowledge. I mean, I've seen so much creative glass, but I didn't realize that was a movement. And you said that was part of what drew you to move to the Bay Area?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so second to Seattle, which has the largest concentration of glass artists in the United States, the Bay Area is traditionally the second largest location. Glass has now proliferated. Sorry. It's really moved into a lot of different areas, but it really started out in academia, and Marvin Lepofsky and Dr. Robert Fritz were two students of Harvey Littleton, and they brought it to California. Marvin Lepofsky starting the program at Berkeley, and then at the California College of the Arts, Dr. Fritz at San Jose State. And those were really some of the first educational centers in the United States. And so a large concentration of glass artists just happened to fall in Northern California. And it historically, a lot of California art has developed around the glass movement as well.
It's very exciting. You have such a background in looking at glass, and one of the things that's really striking to me about your work, Sally, is you have an extraordinary aesthetic. I mean, it's a beautiful aesthetic in what you choose to do and what you create with your glass. And Gina, just as somebody who's worked with her, where do you think this aesthetic comes from in her?
Careful.
It comes from the fact that she's not traditionally a glass artist, and I think it's really, really beautiful. And this is what I really like about students coming in from different disciplines, And what I really like about the studio glass movement in its first 60 years is that most people are coming in from a different lens than the material itself. And so Sally and I spend a lot of time talking about how to get the material to say what you want it to say and to not be beholden to the limitations of the material. So whenever we start a project, we really talk about what is the right process, what is the right use of the material. For example, the piece that's behind Sally, we worked on for a very, very long time, and almost entirely opaque. And so we really had to have a conversation with ourselves about why glass, and does it still need to be glass in order to exist? And we really wrestled with why glass and how glass, and the fact that we were turning a window frame and was a very interesting conversation. But I think in the end, we found a really, really nice balance in her ideas and the articulation of her ideas that if it would have been any other material, I don't think that you'd have the connection that you do when you see it.
It's interesting that all three of you have talked about working with people who have a different knowledge or a different vision or come from a different discipline, and how rich what comes of that. And, so I want to tell people once again that we have this beautiful show at Bolinas Museum, Glass and Ice. It's your first solo show, Sally, in a museum.
Well, it's the first time I've seen my work outside my garage. And I mean, occasionally a piece will be in a show or in a gallery somewhere, but to see it all lined up, when you put the light on it right, it's a very different experience.
And I hope it really impresses you of how extraordinary your work is, because when you see it in that setting, presented as the art that it is, you really, both the message and the art itself is so powerful. I really enjoyed working on this with you.
I want to say one thing that Gina did. I don't know where this will fit in this whole thing, but well, if you look at this piece behind me, my vision was sort of gloom and doom and pissiness. And I wanted that's sort of my normal state. And I was going to have the polar bear being somehow, these things evolve. I didn't have a really good plan. I mean, one of the things that's fun about being a photographer is I have pictures of this whole thing all along the way, and it's really changed. But the polar bear was going to be collapsing under, the weight of all these derricks, and it was going to be gloom and doom. And Gina said, you can't do that. And this was part of this discussion about what and why and how. She said the polar bear has to be emerging. There has to be hope, or there's no point, in just pointing out that the shit is about to hit the fan. We know that. So this is so that changed everything, and it changed the curtains, for example, because I had all these jazzy curtains, which are now, as you know, turned into a bowl in the exhibit for a gift for a friend of mine's getting married, because they were just they took too much away from the image once we got to it. And another time I was making spoons, and I was making spoons that were turquoise and purple and gray, and they just really looked great to me. And she said, if you're going for fragility, I think I would include a little more clear and a little more white. We see that is the kind of thing that we political scientists don't think of first thing. So it's more than I think of Gina and me sort of wrapped around some mold trying to keep the plaster from running into our shoes. But it's also at a much more analytical level. And I think that sounds pretentious, and I'm embarrassed to say it, but there's a lot of thought that I wouldn't have been able to think without being with these people.
Well, is there any last thing that you'd like to share with us, any of you? Well, it's been a real pleasure to have this time together and get more insights into the work all of you do, and particularly more insights in the background of this really extraordinary show that we have here at the Bolinas Museum, the exhibition of your glass and photography addressing the Arctic and the Antarctic. So thank you all so much for being a part of this.
Oh, this has
Thank
been
you.
fun. Thank you.